All right, Phil, are you ready to get started?
I am.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you to everyone who's tuning in here, everyone who's attending this virtual event. A special thank you to all of the ALS patients and caregivers, all of the researchers who are working within academia and industry on ALS treatments. Thanks to all the advocacy organization representatives that are tuning in. And also thank you to my team back at Unite who helped organize this event to put it on. But above all, thank you, Phil, for spending time with us and sharing your perspective. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on Unite and what we're up to. I'll talk a little bit about this event and what to expect, and then I'll introduce you, Phil, and we can get into the Q&A. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right. So my name is Tanner Dagdalen. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Unite Genomics. And we started this company to take some of the technologies that were developed in our research group at the University of California at Berkeley for analyzing big data. They're currently being used at companies like Amazon and YouTube to crunch their data sets. We took, our research was to take those same tools and apply them to health data, in particular to accelerate the development of treatments for diseases that don't have treatments like ALS, don't have effective treatments, I should say, like ALS. And so that was the genesis of the company. But right now, as a company, we are completely focused on accelerating the development of new treatments, cutting years off of the cycle time for researchers as they look for new pathways for treatments, but also the existing treatments that are being researched, getting them to the patients who need them much, much faster. So with that, a little bit about this event. We're thrilled to have Phil here with us. The event is going to focus on clinical trials from the perspective of a patient who has participated in a clinical trial. And Phil is so gracious to be transparent with us about what he experienced and everything that he learned about along the way. And what you can expect is that Phil and I will discuss some of the questions that I prepared ahead of time. And but that said, we want to hear questions from the attendees. Your questions are way better than mine. And so please use the Q&A feature here in the Zoom webinar. And I'll keep that window open so that as questions come in, we can get them answered. I may take some of the questions in the middle of my questions if they seem relevant, but if I don't get to some of the questions during the session with my questions, I'll reserve 10 to 15 minutes or more at the end to answer just audience questions. So feel free to use the Q&A feature in the Zoom window, and I'll answer questions that way. Without further ado, let me introduce Phil. So Phil resides in Winchester, California with his wife and 4 children. He formerly played football for the University of Washington, where he was a member of the historic 1991 national championship team, after which he built a career in technology. Phil was diagnosed with ALS in August of 2018. Since that time, he has been a vocal advocate for the ALS community. He has served leadership and advisory roles in numerous organizations working to support the community or develop therapies, including IMALS, Team Gleason, the International Alliance of ALS/Motor Neuron Disease Associations, Augie's Quest, the ALS Association, Cytokinetics, and MT Pharma, among others. But most relevant to today's conversation, Phil was a trial participant in the recent NurOwn trial, and also serves on the Healy ALS Platform Trial Patient Advisory Committee. So Phil, thank you so much for taking the time to share your advice and perspective with us. I think what might work best for today is to kind of go through the overall timeline of, from I don't know anything about a trial all the way through to I've already participated in a trial, what should I expect? So to kick us off, for the patients out there who don't know anything about trials or what trials are out there, which ones are available to them, where should they start?
Well, where they should start versus where I started are 2 completely different things. And if most patients are anything like myself, I started looking at what trials were out there even prior to receiving my formal diagnosis of ALS, there was probably about a 2-month window in there when between June, so maybe a 3-month window between June and August there in 2018, where in June we kind of knew what the diagnosis was going to be. And while we waited for the diagnosis by elimination and the test to come in, I started doing some research into what therapies are available and found that there really are no therapies available, at least none that are approved by the FDA, that have a meaningful impact on ALS disease progression. So naturally I looked at, okay, well, what therapies are in clinical trial, and started using Dr. Google to try and find out what were the most promising therapies that were in trial that I might be able to get into. And I kept landing on stem cells. And so I reached out to Mayo. Mayo was doing their own stem cell trial, as well as this Brainstorm Neurone trial kept popping up. And so I read reviews and write-ups on that, and it seemed to be a promising therapy that, being new to the disease, I was like, okay, sounds great. Talked to some physician friends of mine, and they thought that this seemed like the most promising path moving forward. And then I received my official diagnosis, and that was kind of the golden ticket now to run and start really expressing my interest in the trials that I did find. So what Dr. Google led me to was ultimately information about the trial on clinicaltrials.gov. And so the neurologist that diagnosed me is not my clinical neurologist. And so I got referred to an ALS clinic. And so when I went to my first ALS clinic visit, I basically came with a laundry list of things that I wanted to talk to that neurologist about, and what trials I thought I would want to participate in based on what I found and what was available on clinicaltrials.gov. So for me, I had to use those resources and consulting with non-ALS doctors about what they thought would be most promising today. And I don't want this to be a platform for me to talk about what I'm ALS has developed, but in our clinical trials and promising therapy committees, we developed something called ALS Signal, which is a list of all the promising therapies that are in clinical trial in ALS. And it's really looking at more than what's in clinicaltrials.gov. We're looking at what's available globally, because as a person living with this disease, I don't want to be limited to what is only available in this country. I would move to Australia if Australia had a clinical trial that was going to significantly impact the disease, the progression of my disease. So we developed this dashboard where a patient can search and look at what therapies might be appropriate for them, and then have a discussion with their clinical neurologist about what options they want to pursue and what would be a good fit for them. So I don't know if my experience is the normal experience, or I assume that most people, once they get diagnosed, rely on their neurologist to provide them with what clinical trial options are available. And so you are relying on how well informed your neurologist is on what is available. So what we've created is essentially, with ALS Signal, is we are informing the patient and caregiver community about what's available, so that they aren't so dependent on their neurologist being informed, but then maybe they can inform their neurologist about trials that they might be able to get into.
Yeah, and I've gone to ALS Signal so many times since it was launched, and I highly recommend if anybody attending here hasn't gone to check it out, go check it out today, because it's really, really useful. And I know that you and the rest of the team spent a lot of time and effort putting it together, but it's going to benefit hundreds, if not thousands, of people.
Yeah, well, I have to give the most of the credit though to Nadia and Callie on our Promising Therapies committee. They really put in the hours to complete all of the nitty-gritty details of almost all of the therapies that are on that dashboard. So I think most of the credit needs to go in their direction.
Got it. And I think you mentioned that a lot of patients talk to their neurologists, and that's their primary source of information regarding clinical trials. How much does talking to your neurologist come into play? Because I think you mentioned in your last conversation with me that you spoke to your neurologist about the NurOwn trial, and actually maybe you can say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, certainly. So it's a little bit awkward being diagnosed by different neurologists and having a second opinion by an ALS specialist neurologist that I'm not going to their clinic. So essentially my official diagnosis allowed me to be referred to an ALS clinic where the doctor at that particular clinic is very well informed about what trials are available. He is very, he's part of the NEALS network. And so he is a active clinical researcher as well as a clinical neurologist. So he was very well informed. And so when I came to him and said, I would like to consider enrolling in the Brainstorm trial, and in fact, I didn't need him to do it. I'd already reached out to Brainstorm and expressed interest at the UC Irvine trial site. He said, well, I'd be surprised if they accepted you because you seem to be a really slow progressor, and they're really only looking for rapid progressors so that they can see a decline, or to see if you do get drug that you're actually, it has an impact on your slope of decline. So I took that with a grain of salt and moved forward and worked directly with UC Irvine. So I didn't even use my ALS clinic as a resource to engage the Brainstorm trial site. I was doing all that on my own and established that relationship. Started having communications with the trial coordinator at UC Irvine, and when I would go back to clinic, I would inform my doctor, oh yeah, they did accept me. I'm in my 3-month observation period. And he's like, well, all right, we'll see how it goes, right? So I feel like if we're dependent on the clinical neurologist to recommend trials for us, they may be doing and recommending what's maybe best for them, or that they're more comfortable or have more knowledge about. And so I think arming the patient community with what information about what's out there is extremely powerful. That said, both my official diagnosis came from a doctor at USC Keck, and he talked about what trials are available out there, and there were maybe like 2 or 3, but the first recommendation from him was, hey, would you be interested in participating in this observational study, or giving us blood so that we can, do some research into essentially at USC, they were looking at induced pluripotent stem cells and creating a line off of the patient blood. And so I said, certainly. So similarly, when I went to my ALS clinic, he introduced me to several observational studies that he was involved with and was pushing those. But did not lead with the clinical trials. And to me, and for most of the patients that I know, today in ALS, where there are no cures, there are really no effective treatments that slow or pause or even reverse your disease progression. Clinical trials represent hope. And so for us to get access to that hope is, to me, and I would say most patients, extremely critical in this disease.
And it sounds like you had to be your own advocate there to get
Definitely.
into the trials. Awesome. Okay, so let's move on just a bit, but just to summarize, it sounds like you have to be your own advocate. You have to identify trials that might be of interest to you. You can't expect your neurologist to tell you everything. And in addition to that, if your neurologist thinks that you may not be able to get into a trial, that doesn't necessarily mean that you won't.
Correct. Yeah, and I think if we all listen to our neurologists and the recommendations, not saying that they don't have the patient interest at heart, but we, like you said, we are our best advocates, and we know what we want. And I mean, I went and saw a clinical neurologist a couple months ago. That this is unrelated to the clinical trials, but his recommendation to me was, then this is outside of my clinics that I go to. His recommendation to me was, well, we don't recommend that people go on ventilation and get tracheostomies because quality of life issues and things like that. And I'm like, who tells a patient that we don't recommend that you continue to live your life? And how does he know what my capabilities will be while I am, on a ventilator versus somebody else? And maybe I want to see my children graduate from college and get married. And whether I am able to walk down the aisle or roll down the aisle on a ventilator, it's really not up to him. So again, that gets back to, we know it's best for ourselves, and we really need to advocate for what we want and not dismiss what the doctor is saying or recommending, but maybe what they're saying is not always 100% the best for you.
Yeah, and along those same lines, I want to talk about what you advise or what you think patients should be considering or think about when they're considering a particular trial. But before we do that, I want to just remind everyone that if you use the Q&A feature, your questions will pop up, and I'll be able to answer them or have Phil answer them live here. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. So yeah, the first question around when somebody is considering a particular trial is pretty general. What do you think people should keep in mind when they're considering a particular trial?
Well, I think if you were asked that question to a neurologist, they're going to tell you, what matters most is that you are contributing and giving back to science, and that your participation will ultimately help us move the science forward. And even though it may not help you, it may benefit somebody that is diagnosed with this disease further down the road, which is great, the benevolence piece of it. We all want to do our part and help out society. But the reality for the patient community is that we are looking for something and participating in something that might actually help us. So from a patient perspective, we are enrolling in a trial and understanding that trial gives us that best shot at hope, and that maybe this will give me 6 more months or another year to be with my family. So from my perspective, when I was looking for a trial, I was looking for what therapy is in trial that represents the most amount of hope that will deliver on that idea of I want to live longer. So, and in my case, it was the Brainstorm Neuron trial. Now, when considering a trial to enroll in, you want to look at what is the ratio of people that are actually getting treatment versus people that are getting placebo, which is the control group. And in the case of the Brainstorm trial, it was 1-to-1. So 50% of the people were randomized into the control or placebo group, and 50% of the people actually received treatment. Everybody went through the same process, however. So keep in mind, if you are in the placebo group, in the case of the Brainstorm trial, you still go through a bone marrow harvest, which, you know, is not a, it's not a procedure that it's not a, you just roll in and they, you know, stick needles in your hip and extract bone marrow. It's a little more involved than that. You also, in the Brainstorm trial, there are a total of 7 lumbar punctures. 4 are just to collect cerebral spinal fluid or CSF, and then 3 collect CSF, but then also you get stem cell transplants. So even if you're in the placebo group and not really receiving any therapy, you still are going through those spinal taps or lumbar punctures just as you were receiving treatment. So understanding and recognizing that placebo usage ratio is going to be very important, because in the case of the Brainstorm trial for me, it was a coin flip. Am I going to receive treatment, or am I going to go through all of this and receive nothing? The level of hope, the hope factor in that trial was high enough for me to do that coin flip. Now, that said, in trials moving forward, like the platform trial, they are working really hard to reduce the number of people that get assigned to that placebo group. So if I were entering a trial today, I would look for what trials give me at least a 2-to-1, which is a 33% chance of being in the placebo group versus the treatment arm. I want the better odds, but then again, you have to look at what the hope factor is and what's more important to you. And so I would start with that placebo usage is important, but for me, what would trump that is if that trial has something called open label extension. So what that means is, even if I were in that placebo, even if it was a 50-50 placebo to treatment, if they have open label extension, if that trial lasted 6 months and I was in the placebo arm, at the conclusion of my participation in that trial, I now actually get to receive the therapy. So for me, we should not have any ALS trials moving forward that don't offer access to drug after your participation in the trial. So now look at it from a different perspective. If you're in that trial and you think you received treatment and you actually believe that that treatment benefited you and slowed your progression, imagine if that trial, like the Brainstorm trial, didn't have open label extension, and now that treatment that was benefiting you, now you don't have access to that. So now your disease then starts to decline again, and you don't get access to the treatment that actually you were realizing a benefit from. So that's one of the reasons why open label extension is a must in all ALS trials moving forward, so that even if you were in that placebo group, you get access to it to see if it helps. And then if the therapy helped you, you're able to continue on that therapy after your participation in the trial is concluded. And then I would say that those are the two main things that I would look at. There are inclusion-exclusion criteria that are also important, but you are not going to be able to pick and choose what trial you're going to be in if you don't even meet the inclusion-exclusion criteria, which may be scientifically justified and they may not be, such as if a trial arbitrarily decides that the age cutoff is 60 years old, there may be no scientific justification why it's 60 years old. They just decided that it would be 60 years old. So from a patient advocacy side, we fight to make sure that when a trial is being designed, there is a scientific justification for the inclusion-exclusion criteria that they're using. And if there isn't, then we fight to have that particular piece of criteria eliminated. So, but I would say look for the placebo usage and open label extension as really the most important things in a trial.
Yeah, I think you also mentioned something that's really important the last time we talked, which is, there were a set of questions that you asked the trial coordinator early on at the beginning of the trial that I think it might be helpful for folks to know about. Specifically, I think you talked about, if there were ER visits that resulted from the procedure to administer the drug, are they going to cover that? And, or, things like travel. If you have to travel to the trial site, are they going to cover the cost of travel? All that sort of thing. What are some of the questions that you recommend people make sure they bring up if it's not mentioned with the trial coordinator when they're considering enrolling?
Certainly, yeah. So in the case of, in my case, I'd had a lumbar puncture for when I was participating in another research program at UCSF. And that lumbar puncture resulted in me having a very significant LP headache that required me to ultimately go to the emergency room and get what's called a blood patch to plug that hole that CSF was leaking from in my spine. And so, and then I realized what that cost because I had to submit the cost of that ER visit to the researcher at UCSF. So I was acutely aware of this could be very expensive if I experienced another LP headache and had to get a blood patch in the future. And considering the Brainstorm trial has 7 lumbar punctures, I wouldn't want to have to go and cover the ER visits if I had to get 7 blood patches. So my question to the coordinator up front was, if I do have to go to the ER, is the company going to cover the expense of the ER visit? Nobody had ever asked her that question before. And so she had to follow up with the company and confirm that, yes, the company would cover the expense of that ER visit if I did need a blood patch. So I think the questions you want to ask going in are those kind of hidden costs that might trip you up. So you mentioned travel, and does the trial cover travel? And if so, does that include travel for your caregiver? So one important thing to note is in this disease, when you typically need some sort of assistance or caregiver to go with you to these visits. So it's not just you, the patient, that's participating, it's you and your caregiver. And so if you have to get on an airplane and travel to another city for your trial visits, it's important to note that if they do cover travel, do they cover it for your caregiver? And if they don't, then the cost for you to participate in this trial is going to not only be your travel costs, but travel costs of your caregiver. So there are some kind of hidden things that you want to consider that it doesn't hurt to ask the questions up front. And what if they say, yeah, we'll cover that? Or maybe you can be the one to open their eyes to realize that, wow, okay, in the case of the Brainstorm trial, there's 14 visits to the clinic site. Brainstorm doesn't cover any of your travel costs. So I was fortunate enough to live within an hour and 15 minutes of the clinic that I visited. And so my travel costs were very minimal. I know of people that had to use GoFundMe's to raise money just to travel to their clinic visit in this trial. So travel costs are, understanding what that is going to look like is an important kind of hidden piece of participating in a trial.
Yeah, and it sounds like talking to other patients who have participated in trials before is a great way to kind of uncover some of those questions that you may not think of right away, but are so critical. We do have a question from the audience here, and I'm going to rephrase it slightly. The question is, when there are multiple trials that you may be interested in, how do you compare maybe 2 or 3 trials to determine which is more likely to help you? And I'll just rephrase that to, how did you think about, what sort of resources did you read? How did you learn about the potential benefit that a particular mechanism of action or drug might have? I mean, obviously these are not approved drugs, and the reason why they're in trials is that there's no data on whether or not they're effective. And so you really can't make any statements about whether it will be or will not be effective and what effect it will have. But that said, that doesn't stop you from doing research. So what research did you do?
I talked to as many people as I could, which was very limited. Most people don't understand the disease. And then trying to find people that, so in the case of the Brainstorm trial, it was a phase 3 trial. I didn't even think to reach out to people that participated in the phase 2 trial to see their thoughts on the therapy. But looking back and knowing what I know now about different subgroups of ALS, and ALS being multiple diseases under what I consider an umbrella term, and even understanding whether a therapy is targeting maybe more bulbar onset versus limb onset people, or that may work better on faster progressors versus slow progressors, trying to understand those nuances of the therapy and getting some insights into that would be helpful in determining which trial you should consider. But unfortunately, most people don't have access to the information that will inform them on maybe this is a better fit because this therapy might better match your subtype or subgroup of ALS. Even your neurologist may not know or may not even believe that there are different subtypes or subgroups of ALS. And you're really left to pick and choose what trials are based on proximity. Like, is that trial site close to where I live? And then similarly, all right, what are the chances of being in the placebo group or actually getting treatment? So I think those are the things that today most people are going to look at to help them determine what therapy or what trial they're going to try and get in. Inclusion exclusion criteria may determine that for you a little bit, in that if your breathing is not very strong and your SVC or FVC don't meet the minimum thresholds for inclusion, then that's going to determine whether you're going to be in that trial or not anyway. So it really does depend on I think those other items, because trying to anticipate your whether you will be a responder to a therapy is really difficult to do. And I think ultimately that's what precision medicine will tell us, and we'll be able to better understand whether it's through having your genome sequenced and that coupled with your phenotype put you in a specific subgroup, and then hopefully down the road we better understand what therapies target what subgroups or would be better responders. And so we're just not there yet today. And so it really does boils down to those items I talked about: convenience, and maybe one pays for travel, one doesn't. That's going to influence you towards one trial over the other. Or in our ALS signal, we have something called the PACT rating. PACT stands for the patient-centric trial design, where we go in and rate phase 3 trials based on whether we think the elements that they design their trial, if they're patient-centric. And so we are in the beginning process of helping people determine if that's what's important to you. If patient-centric trial design is important to you, you can look at our PACT ratings in the ALS signal dashboard to help guide you if you so choose. But that has no indication on whether the therapy is effective or not. It's strictly about, did this sponsor or drug company design their trial with the patient in mind?
And I'll just mention, if you're a researcher or a representative from a life sciences company who's developing therapies for ALS, go take a look at the PACT rating system. Go take a look at the trials that have the best ratings and those that don't have the best ratings. And it's an important learning resource to figure out how to design trials that actually work for patients, given their circumstances and what's easy and what's challenging for them. So the next kind of section I want to get into is during the trial itself, what should patients expect? And you participated in the NurOwn trial, but maybe you can stick to the more general elements. I know you mentioned that talking to other patients who had participated in a similar trial was helpful to you. Maybe you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, so I'm going to start with my experience in the trial that I participated in. My trial site was fantastic. I loved going and seeing them every month. And I'm hopeful that other trial sites are like that and are as efficient and organized and coordinated as UC Irvine is. I've heard stories that some aren't, and that, but we can all strive to be better in how we treat people, even if it's just a trial, right? So, but what you can expect and what you get today are maybe two different things. So, what me and several of my colleagues are doing at IMALS is learning from our trial experiences and how can we make trial experiences for people moving forward better. That starts with patient-centric trial design. But even beyond that, communication is important. So if, for example, like I don't really know if I'm going to learn that I was part of the placebo group or part of the treatment arm. I don't know if I'll have access to, you know, the overall results of the trial. Um, those sort of things, I think, if you participate in the trial, you would expect to learn about the results. You're sold when your neurologist or whoever, you may be told, hey, do this for the good of science. Well, the return on doing it for the good of science is actually, what did my contribution yield in this research? So I think my expectation, or our expectation as a patient community, is we should be able to understand what our contribution was and the result of the trial or that research that we participated in, and know where we fell or what our role was in that research. So I would like to know if that therapeutic worked for me or not, even if the trial was quote unquote a failure. Did I respond to their therapy? And so I think there are a lot of things that you would expect and that we should demand moving forward. And so part of what our goal is in working with people designing clinical trials moving forward is sharing of that information. Particularly if that trial fails, we need to, as a community, understand why that trial failed so that we can learn from those failures. Because if we don't understand why it failed, how can we fix things in the future? And we may repeat the reasons why that trial failed may be repeated in the future. So we need to learn from those failures. Otherwise, that research that we volunteered for is in vain. So we want to make sure that there's a little more information sharing and communication. What else can you expect? Yeah,
As another follow-up question on that, do you think it's useful to talk to other patients who are in the same trial or were in similar trials about their experience?
yeah, and I think it's inevitable. I think the people that are sponsoring the trial don't want you to speak to other people in the trial, but it's inevitable. And with the advent of Facebook groups and things like that, you can essentially have a group that forms that nobody has visibility to other than, oh, I know this person's in the trial. You get invited, and you can share your experiences and talk about, ooh, I have this weird pain, or I noticed that I was able to do this, or my voice got better. And then people can say, yeah, me too. And so it's almost like a impromptu or ad hoc trial support group. And you become essentially a family that is able to share your experiences. And I know from my personal experiences within a brainstorm group, you can also be a cheerleader for people that might be finding it difficult to get to the trial site, and remind them that, hey, it's important to follow through and do this, or just provide them with support in general. Some people may find it really difficult to do this sort of thing, and it's a good way to lean on each other. And I don't think it hurts the science at all, especially since we can't control what the data is that's collected. But I think it's important for the morale of the people participating.
Yeah, and from a scientific perspective, the rationale is really clear that you you could harm the placebo control as a control with communication between people, and you know, that's oftentimes the rationale behind it. That said, you know, if there's a way that you know, the community can come together, I mean, maybe not with patients within the same trial, but with, you know, with similar trials to help, you know, like you said, be a cheerleader, or also give advice for how to, you know, make yourself successful in the trial, given that it's another thing you're adding to an already busy life and all of that. You know, everyone can win from that. So we do have a couple questions here that I want to get to from the audience. Give me 1 second while I pull up one of them. So we have a question about once you participate in a clinical trial, are you excluded from participating in future clinical trials? Phil, if you have an answer here, you feel free to answer. I also can share some perspective.
Yeah, it depends. So some trials, like in the case of the Brainstorm trial, some trials would not allow you to participate because it's unknown, really, the lingering effect that therapy, if you did receive treatment, is it going to impact the results of the study that you're going to possibly be enrolling in the future. That said, for the Healy platform trial, the washout period is about a month for every therapy. So you could have participated in a trial, whether it's Brainstorm stem cell trial, the Amylyx trial, and once you've experienced that 1 month washout period and you still meet the eligibility criteria, you are able to enroll in the Healy platform trial. So it really does depend on the trial and what their guidelines are for that sort of thing. For me, it was worth it to me. Again, the hope factor was high enough in the Brainstorm trial for me to participate in that trial, even if it meant that I wouldn't be able to do any more clinical trials moving forward. That said, I'll get on my little soapbox again. That's why we fight so hard, though, for expanded access in ALS. So expanded access means that for those people that don't qualify for a clinical trial, whether it's because you don't meet the inclusion or you have something that excludes you from participating in the trial, such as, you know, you were in a trial that excludes you from participating in a future trial. Now there's a pathway for you to actually receive that same therapy that's in trial, called expanded access. So me and my colleagues at IMALS we work very, very hard, and it's our priority these days with companies and sponsors that are designing their trials moving forward, that they budget both financially and with their when they're manufacturing their therapeutics to have expanded access so that we can deliver that hope to people that haven't had access to it. So if you use the number of 30,000 people living with ALS in the US, some people say it's 20, I like to use 30. There are less than 1,000 seats on the clinical trial bus in ALS for people to get access to these experimental therapies. So you can see how we need expanded access so that we're in a disease where there are no therapies, effective therapies, getting access to these experimental therapies is extremely important, and that's going to be through expanded access programs moving forward. Sorry, I'm off my soapbox.
No, that's totally fine. And I think we have another question about expanded access programs. The question was, how does expanded access work if you don't qualify for Healy? And I think they're referring to the Healy ALS platform trial. And, you know, I think I'll just actually, Phil, do you have an answer for that? I have a quick answer if you don't.
Well, so what we're trying to fight for with the Healy platform trial is that all Healy therapies will ultimately someday be have expanded access programs to qualify for the platform. We're not there yet, but even then, the number of slots available today are minimal. We're trying to grow those, and we're trying to grow those not only for the Healy trial, but for any clinical trial through important, again, I'm going to get my soapbox, sorry, important legislation right now in the House. HR 7071 is a bill that is designed exclusively to help fund expanded access programs in ALS clinical trials. So it's really important to get your legislator on board to sponsor, co-sponsor HR 7071 so that we can broaden and increase the access and availability of these experimental therapies under expanded access. All right, I'm off.
I'm sure we'll get you back on the soapbox in no time. I'll just add that at our last virtual event, we talked with Dr. Sabrina Paganoni, who's one of the co-lead PIs on the Healy ALS platform trial, and she mentioned this was a month ago, so I'm not very current on the situation, but she mentioned that at the time they were still working on an expanded access program, and that they're working very hard on it, and they're securing the funds for it, and it's coming imminently, but they're working on it right now. So Phil, I don't know if you have an update on what the status is there, but if you don't, regardless of what we say here, Phil, if you don't have the links from the last event to go find the Healy ALS platform trial site where they have information about things like that, and there's even contact information to get a hold of the trial sponsor, email us and we're happy to send you the links again. So go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, and I don't have anything concrete to update on that other than when those of us on the patient advisory committee for the Healy ALS platform trial learned that there was no expanded access. There's open label extension, but no expanded access. We're like, whoa, hang on. We need to have a discussion about expanded access. And since that time, Dr. Paganoni and Dr. Skovic have been working painlessly to try and get expanded access on the platform trial as a priority. And that was a result of the patients, saying we need this. So we are fighting to get access to people that don't qualify for trials. And it's common in other disease indications, and we need to make it commonplace in ALS.
I totally agree. We have another question here that is, when is the Healy trial? And I'm not sure if they mean the expanded access program or when is the trial recruiting, but just to get everyone clear, the Healy trial is already recruiting. There are sites that are already up and recruiting. You can find the status of every site on the website for the Healy ALS platform trial. And again, if you don't have a link for that, feel free to email us, and we're happy to provide the link to their website where you can find information about which sites are recruiting and that sort of thing. Okay, we have another question here, which is, I'll just read it out loud here. It says, Phil, you look great. Have we got any updates on the progress of congressional and Senate help with legislation to help in the fight? Maybe you can give a brief answer here, because we want to keep the conversation focused on what it's like to be in trials and afterwards, but I think this is relevant.
Well, thanks, Roy. I appreciate that. We are making significant progress on specifically HR 7071. The the amount of co-sponsors is increasing daily, and that's thanks to the ALS community just rallying behind this initiative. And I'm not going to commit to any dates, but there will be a Senate companion bill that will be dropping soon. So we'll have both activity bills in the House and the Senate that are moving forward to help fund expanded access programs in ALS.
And I'll just kind of reiterate, if you haven't, got in touch with your Congress people to get make sure that they know that you care about that piece of legislation. There's a link on the ALS website that allows you to very easily do that with everything templated and ready to go. So I highly encourage you do that. Okay, we have another couple questions here. So we have a question. Can you please clarify what expanded access is? Is it that if you don't qualify for any trial or for that particular trial, or you just could not get a spot because of space limitations?
So technically, the definition or the requirements under the FDA guidelines for expanded access are expanded access or compassionate use is a pathway for people with a terminal disease that where options are limited and you don't qualify for a clinical trial in that disease. There's a little bit of wiggle room, I think, in whether it's for a specific trial that you don't qualify for. So just because there's a trial for ALS that you may qualify for. So let's use this example. If I had an SOD1 gene mutation and I did not qualify for the Biogen trial, the BIB trial, the ASO trial for SOD1, and just because there was a trial for a therapeutic in ALS that I did qualify for, I would still be able to apply for expanded access to that Biogen trial because I didn't qualify for that particular trial. So that's the way that we understand it. And if that's not how the policymakers understand it, we need to change how they understand. Because we can't say that, oh, this therapy you do qualify for this therapy, which may be a trial that is not even a therapeutic, but maybe they're looking at some sort of supplement. Well, that's not, we need to look at apples to apples here. And it really needs to be about, if you don't meet or didn't get into a trial, you should be able to apply for access to that under what's expanded access or compassionate use.
And I know we have additional questions here that we weren't able to get to. And just, normally with our virtual events, if we don't get to some of the questions, we typically follow up with answers to those questions via email so that everyone can see the answers to those questions as well. So if you didn't get your question answered today, keep an eye out for the email that may have an answer to your question. But with that, this concludes the Q&A session. I want to thank everyone for attending and for submitting questions and advocating for yourselves. I want to thank Phil for being so generous with your time and sharing all the perspective that you have. I also want to thank you, Phil, for taking on making the circumstances for future ALS patients better. No, you didn't have to do that. Nobody asked you to do that. And yet you're putting an enormous amount of effort in to make things better for future patients. And, it's an enormous contribution, and it's, every day you're making a difference, and, we see it for sure. And I know the patients appreciate it as well. but we just want to give our thanks as well. So thank you, Phil, for everything that you do and for answering questions in this event.
All right, thanks, Tanner, for giving me the opportunity to, answer these questions and be a part of this.
And I think, we can all agree that nothing happens unless we get into action. And Phil mentioned a couple ways that we can do that. You can get in touch with your Congress people to get them to take action on some of the legislation that's there. You can take a look at the ALS Signal dashboard to see what therapies may be available to you. You can get in touch with some of the trial coordinators to see if you might want to participate in the trials. You can also stay connected with Unite so that you can stay up to date on what's happening in clinical trials. We're going to continue these virtual events. We're going to be releasing our portal imminently to help inject even more data into the hands of researchers who are trying to discover therapies and accelerate the process of getting them to the patients who need them. But in general, as always, the time to act is now. So, take up the opportunity and take action on one of those things. And with that, we'll see you next time. Thank you so much, Phil.
All right, thank you.